Today we're going to be installing the stock breaker on an aftermarket battery harness. This is a Surron Light B. You will need a solder gun and some solder to get this done. First thing you're going to want to do, get your front battery plate loose. It's those two bolts on the side. Access your cables on your controller. We're going to want to take the negative and positive cables off, but before you do that, make sure you drain any residual power from the bike with the key on and the battery out. Get your aftermarket harness, line it up to where the breaker would be, mark this area, and you're going to want to splice the sheathing that protects the cables. Find a good spot on your positive wire to cut that will reach the breaker and still leave you enough length up top to reach your battery. Go ahead and cut this, and we're going to want to strip 3/4 of an inch of the insulation off of the wire, and this is what we're going to end up soldering. Found a nice little trick. If you use a zip tie on the end of it, it'll keep all the cables together and stop it from fraying. Soldering this is an important part of this process. If you don't use solder and you just try to throw these in your stock breaker, eventually they will pull out. There's nothing for that stock breaker to cinch down on other than those wires, and if they move easily, your harness will probably end up pulling out of the breaker. Keep in mind, I'm no professional solderer, don't have the best equipment. This solder gun was probably not hot enough for the gauge wire that I was trying to solder, but what you're going to want to do is fill those ends up as much as you can. Heat them up, put as much solder in there as you can, try to make them solid. I got away with what I had. Kind of a butcher job, but they ended up being solid. They weren't going to fray. When the breaker compresses them, they didn't give way. It was enough to get me by. After you're done soldering, they should look something like this, hopefully a little better than mine. Mine's not great at all, but super easy from here. What you're going to do, take your stock breaker, throw one end of the cable into one side of the breaker, and go ahead and screw it down. There's a clamp in there that when you tighten the screw, it clamps on the cable. I wouldn't tighten it too much. You can see the case of my breaker kind of splitting apart right there. I ended up loosening it just a little bit. Make sure that cable's not going to come out. I give mine a few good pulls right here. Make sure it's solid and not going to eventually fall out. Go ahead, take the other side of your harness, put it in the other side of the breaker, and tighten it down. I don't have any footage of me installing the breaker on my bike. It was just too much of a pain to get. But it's 4 long bolts in between the stock breaker and the battery plate. There's a little tiny plastic washer. You'll want to make sure that you have those in there. It spaces the breaker out from the battery plate just a little bit. But once you have all that done, go ahead and mount your battery cables back onto your controller. Make sure to check up on your cable management. This is a good time to check your phase wire screws and make sure they're still tight and torqued to spec. Go ahead, throw your front controller plate back on, and we're going to end up seeing here in a second that when I turn my bike on with the breaker on, it does turn on. This is what you want. Torp is a controller company that tells you in order to keep your stock or your warranty for your controller, you need the stock breaker installed. They are kind of iffy on if they'll warranty your device if you don't have a stock breaker. So if you do want to keep Torp happy, you do want to keep your Torp warranty, but you are running an aftermarket battery cable set or an aftermarket battery that doesn't use the stock cables, this is the only way that I have found to run a stock breaker. Chi does have a fuse in their harness, which does the same thing as a stock breaker, but that fuse is not enough to please Torp. Torp really wants you to still rock that stock breaker or a breaker of better quality. I go ahead, I throw my battery in, I'll plug it up, and then turn the bike on, and we should see your LCD light up or your stock display light up, and your bike should run normally.